Picture a Viking. Go ahead, take a second. Chances are you're seeing a bearded warrior in a fur cloak with two horns jutting out of his helmet. That image is everywhere. Helmets, mascots, Halloween costumes, movie posters. It's basically shorthand for the entire Viking Age. There's just one problem. It never happened. Not once. No Viking warrior ever walked into battle wearing a horned helmet. And the story of how that image took over the world is more interesting than most people realize. Let's start with what archaeologists have actually found. Across Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and the British Isles, researchers have spent decades digging through burial mounds, bogs, and battlefield sites from the Viking Age. That's roughly the 8th through 11th centuries. In all of that searching, they've turned up exactly one complete helmet that can be definitively called Viking. 1. It was found in 1943 at a farm called Gjermundbu in Norway, buried in a grave mound alongside weapons and other equipment. The helmet is made from 17 pieces of iron riveted together. It has a rounded cap, a guard that wraps around the eyes and nose, and a smooth outer surface designed so blades would slide off rather than catch. It has no horns, no wings, no decoration of any kind beyond basic protective function. That's it. That's the whole picture. Here's why that matters. If horned helmets existed during the Viking Age, we'd expect to find some evidence of them. We'd find the helmets themselves, or horn attachments, or grave goods suggesting they existed, or artwork from the period showing warriors wearing them. None of that exists. Contemporary Viking Age carvings, runestones, and tapestries show warriors with simple rounded helmets or no helmet at all. Even Christian monks, who wrote extensively about Viking raids and had every reason to portray them as terrifying monsters, never once mentioned horns. The absence of evidence here is itself evidence. These people documented Vikings in enormous detail, and not one of them thought to mention the horns because there weren't any to mention. Now, think about it practically. You're a Norse warrior about to fight in a shield wall. Your enemies are inches away. The fighting is close, brutal, and chaotic. In that situation, what would two large horns on your helmet actually do for you? They'd give your opponent something to grab. They'd catch on shields. They'd snag on a tree branch if you moved through dense terrain. They'd throw off your balance. A horn sticking out of your helmet is not a weapon. It's a handle. Any experienced fighter would know this immediately. And Vikings were nothing if not experienced fighters. Their helmets were designed to protect the skull and face without adding anything that could get you killed. Practicality was the entire point. So where did the image come from? The short answer is opera. The longer answer starts in the 1820s with a Swedish artist named Gustav Malmström, who illustrated a book called The Saga of Frithjof, a retelling of a Norse tale. His kings and warriors wore helmets decorated with small lateral horns and even dragon wings. It was dramatic. It looked ancient and powerful. But Malmström wasn't illustrating history. He was illustrating myth, and the distinction got lost almost immediately. Then in 1876, a costume designer named Carl Emil Doppler was tasked with creating the visual world for Richard Wagner's massive opera cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen. He needed his Norse characters to look unmistakably ancient and fierce. He gave them horned helmets. Wagner's operas were among the most culturally dominant events of the 19th century. Audiences across Europe saw them, wrote about them, painted scenes from them. Within a generation, the horned helmet was synonymous with the Viking. There's another layer to this story that often gets left out. In 1942, a peat worker in Denmark made a discovery in a bog near a town called Viksø. He pulled out two extraordinary bronze helmets decorated with large curved horns, bird's eyes, and beak-like projections. They were spectacular. For a while, some people assumed they were Viking. They looked the part. They fit the image everyone already had. But they weren't Viking at all. Radiocarbon dating placed them at around 900 BC, more than 1,000 years before the Viking Age even began. These were Bronze Age ritual objects, almost certainly used for ceremonial purposes by priests or figures of authority, never worn in battle. The Near East and Mediterranean have a long tradition of horned helmet imagery tied to divine power and rulership, and that symbolism appears to have traveled north through trade routes long before any Norse warrior ever picked up a sword. So the horned helmet existed. It just didn't exist anywhere near the time or place people assumed. Now, why did the myth spread so successfully and stick so stubbornly? Part of the answer is that the image arrived at exactly the right moment. The 19th century was a period of intense national identity building across Scandinavia and Northern Europe. Countries wanted heroic ancestral figures. They wanted symbols of strength and independence rooted in the deep past. A Viking with a horned helmet looked like exactly that kind of symbol. Artists, writers, and eventually advertisers latched onto it. By the time cinema arrived in the early 20th century, the horned helmet was already so embedded in popular culture that filmmakers used it without question. Each new film, each new illustration, each new children's book reinforced the image. Correction became almost impossible because the myth had a 100-year head start on the historians. Think about how your brain processes historical imagery. You don't usually learn about ancient cultures from primary sources or academic journals. You learn from movies, from logos, from Halloween costumes, from the mascot on your favorite sports team. The Minnesota Vikings have been wearing horned helmets as a logo since 1961. That image has been seen by millions of people who will never encounter the Gjermundbu helmet or read anything about Bronze Age Scandinavia. The brain stores that repeated visual as a fact, not consciously. It just becomes part of what a Viking is, the same way a cowboy has a hat and a samurai has a topknot. Accuracy doesn't drive those images. Drama does. Here's what real Viking warriors actually looked like going into battle. Most of them wore leather caps or padded headgear. Iron helmets were expensive and difficult to produce, so they were reserved for elite fighters or chieftains who could afford them. The Spangenhelm style, which used iron bands riveted across the skull with iron or leather panels filling the gaps, was the closest thing to standard equipment among those wealthy enough to own metal armor. Chainmail was also expensive and relatively rare. Most Norse fighters went into combat with a shield, a weapon, and whatever head protection their resources allowed. These were practical men solving practical problems, not theatrical performers trying to look intimidating for a crowd. The actual Viking Age was defined by seafaring, trade, settlement, and yes, raiding. But the people who lived it were shaped by real constraints. Weight, cost, mobility, and survival in close combat dictated every piece of equipment they carried. A helmet that worked against a sword blow mattered. A helmet that looked impressive to an opera audience in 1876 would have gotten someone killed. The two things have almost nothing to do with each other, but one of them became the defining image of an entire civilization. What's remarkable is how thoroughly the myth displaced the reality, and how little it took to make that happen. One opera production, one influential set of illustrations, a few decades of reinforcement through popular art. That was enough to rewrite how the entire modern world visualizes a culture that actually existed. The Gjermundbu helmet sits in a museum in Oslo, simple and iron and completely hornless, basically ignored by the popular imagination. And the man in the horned helmet is still on billboards and beer cans and team jerseys, as permanent as any fact ever was.